Alright, let's go over percents. First thing to note is that this is the percent sign. So if we want to write a percent, we should write the number followed by this sign. Okay, but what does a percent actually mean? Well, it'll be easier if we just go through some examples. So 10%, for example, actually means 10 out of 100. So if we have 10% of something, then we would expect that if we started with 100, 10% of that would be 10. Likewise, 40% means 40 out of 100. And 50% would mean 50 out of 100. Alright, so let's use this to represent these. Okay, here I have a 10 by 10 square. Altogether there are 100 smaller squares here. So I'm going to represent 10% with green. So if 10% is green, then out of this square of 100 small squares, I'm going to color 10 of them in green. So this represents 10% of the entire shape here. I'll make 40% of them orange. So in this case, I'm going to color in 40 of them. So 40% of this shape is now orange. And 50% I'll represent with pink. So I'll color in 50 of these pink. So this gives you a visual representation of how percents work. Alright, but at this point, you should probably know how to convert fractions into equivalent fractions. So that's what we're going to do now. This 10%, or 10 out of 100, can actually be reduced. We could divide both of these numbers by 10. So 10 divided by 10 would give us 1, and 100 divided by 10 would give us 1/10. Same for 40 over 100. Both of these can be reduced by 10. 40 divided by 10 is 4. 100 divided by 10 is 10. So 40% is the same as 4/10. 10% is the same as 1/10. And finally, 50%, which is 50 over 100, can be reduced by 10. So we divide both of these by 10. We have 5. 100 divided by 10 is 10. So right now it's probably a little difficult to see how this actually makes sense. So let me kind of redraw this. I'm going to break this down into tenths rather than into 100ths. So if there are 100 squares, 1/10 of them would be 10. So every 10 squares will be boxed in. So now this is a 1/10. Let's make that black instead. So this is a 1/10. This is a 1/10. 1/10. So now you can kind of see it taking shape, and maybe it's starting to make sense. So this 10%, which is 1/10, is this whole thing. If we just color this whole thing in, you'll see that this is actually 1/10 of this entire shape. So this rectangle represents 1/10. And for 40%, which is equal to 4/10, we have these 4 rectangles outlined in black. And for 50%, which is 5/10, we have these 5 skinny rectangles shaded in pink. We could reduce these further though. This 4/10 could be reduced to 2/5. But it's going to be a little difficult to represent that with the way I shaded it in. Let's take a look at this 50% though. 50%, which is 5/10, could be reduced, numerator and denominator, by dividing by 5, to 1/2. So if I just outline 1/2, we have this top half, which is made up of green and orange squares, and this bottom half, which is exclusively pink squares. So you see 50% equals 1/2. So we actually covered how to change percents into fractions. To change a percent into a fraction, we're just simply going to write that number over 100 and then reduce it if possible. So if we had a number such as 25%, we just write it as 25/100, and we could reduce that. So 25 goes into both of these, we're left with 1/4. If we add 35%, we could write it as 35/100, and we could reduce this because 5 goes into both of these numbers. 35 divided by 5 is 7. 100 divided by 5 is 20. 80% would be 80/100. And to reduce that, well, let's first, maybe you don't see the greatest common factor right away, but we know that 10 goes into both of them. So divide the numerator and denominator by 10. And we have 8/10. So we can reduce this further by dividing them both by 2. So 8 divided by 2 is 4. 10 divided by 2 is 5. Or, right off the bat, maybe you notice that 20 goes into both of these, and that would be the greatest common factor. So 80 divided by 20 would be 4, and 100 divided by 20 is 5. So when we're changing these, or converting them into fractions, we're just going to write whatever the number is, such as 25/100, and reduce it if we can.